Good afternoon and welcome to the TK Show. I'm your host for the day, TK. And today we're going to be taking a very different uh, analysis into South African politics because today we have Mr. Gundo Maswime, who's what I would term a technocrat / academic joining us. And he's from the field of civil engineering, which is not a field I think that gets too much of a say in South Africa. And the topic for today, we're looking at bringing public infrastructure to South Africa's political thinking. Mr. Maswime, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, TK. Thank you for hosting me.
No, not a problem. For maybe a quick, for those that don't know you, we know you're quite prodigious on Twitter, especially you and Miss Zilla. Your takes are quite hilarious. If you could just maybe give us an introduction into yourself and maybe walk us into how we got to this subject of you being brought here for public infrastructure.
All right, thanks. My academic background is civil engineering. I'm a civil engineer, but I always had an interest in practicing in the public sector. So for that reason, I determined very early on in my career that I'm going to have to build a profile or to study public administration, public policy, which is part of political science. I did that at postgrad level. I left the private sector after just 4 years and went into the public sector and I worked there. And that is where I started realizing that what we normally have on the design floor, what we normally discuss on the design floor in our consulting spaces as it pertains to government is not actually the case. Our analysis is informed mostly by the media and what we hear every day and all the other things that might be historical and so on. So this gave me an opportunity to do a fresh perspective of the interface between what I do and politics, ideology, and so forth. And I've since been quite vocal about that, hence you're talking about Twitter and so on, to say public service is not what most people think it is, so it is on that basis that I'm here to discuss the linkages between infrastructure and politics.
No, thanks for that introduction, Mr. Maswime. But I think it also would be pretty interesting if maybe one were to ask you that. I like what you say, that there's a disjuncture between the reality of being a public servant and what is portrayed out there. And maybe if you could just quickly, why is that? Because you would think that, the private sector in South Africa, especially engineering, is always said to be about hard numbers. There's no such thing as ideology. It's supposed to be numbers. But your description tells me that maybe more work needs to be done on just explaining even to the private sector how the public sector works. If you could just maybe walk us through that.
Okay, I'll give you a simple example. We, as engineers, what we design is designed on a canvas that is created by town planners. So they do the layout and we put the infrastructure there. Now, you know that South Africa has got a history of spatial segregation, which also translated into segregation in terms of access to infrastructure, public infrastructure. You will remember that all of that was done by professional engineers and professional town planners. It was not just politicians. Politicians carried the ideology, but the engineers and the town planners of the day, they did it so successfully that today we're actually struggling to undo it. So if you are going to say that professional persuasions are value-free and completely divorced from politics and ideology, then I think you would already start to see that it was we are where we are because of what was done by engineers then. What has now happened is that we have a momentum coming from 1994 when we had our transition. We didn't stop all the engineers and say all the engineers that worked in the past, we are now going to get rid of all of you because we are changing an ideology. We continued with the same group of engineers. They are the ones that mentored the current crop of engineers. and the mentoring happens very subconsciously. So that is why it's been very difficult to reverse those legacies. Now, on top of that, an explanation needs to be given for the failures of the democratic dispensation when it comes to the provision of infrastructure. And what we see is that it's normally reduced to cadre deployment, it's reduced to incompetence, it is reduced to corruption. Those three things exist in the public sector and the private sector. And in fact, the two sectors are equal enablers, yes. But I long for a day where those three things will no longer be a factor in the South African public sector. Because on that day, we'll then realize that our problems were not actually, those were not the major problems. There are other fundamental problems. It's just those three are what the media has presented very consistently, and they actually absolve those that would have been sympathetic to the old regime to feel that we gave them the country and they made it up for themselves. So that is a very important, I know I'm making a very bold statement, but I was converted when I joined the public sector. I worked for the best organizations. I worked for the worst organizations. And I realized that there's actually a more, scientific explanation to what actually happens in South Africa, in the South African government.
No, I think I do like that explanation, Mr. Gundo, and we'll explore it a bit more. I do like what you say, that what we're playing with here is, or what we're supposed to be addressing is legacy. I think there's one book I remember reading, The Last Afrikaner Leaders, where they speak about how the townships were designed, that if you look at most townships in South Africa, there's only one major road. That was not an accident. It was so that the Nales could come in and leave very quickly. So I find that very interesting. But Mr. Gundo, and maybe a pushback would also be, we've had the RDP, we've had GEAR, we've had ASGISA, Accelerated Shared Growth Initiative, we've had the New Growth Path, we have the Industrial Policy Action Plan, and we also have the National Development Plan, and I think in your field there's a National Infrastructure Plan of 2012. Yes. So we have these policies. Are you also saying that maybe they also don't get to, like what you're saying, they don't quite have a good sectoral understanding of the history? And if that's the case, how do we change that thinking so that public infrastructure is aware of the legacies, and also we actually put policies in place that advance and actually tear down the legacies of apartheid and colonialism in infrastructure? Yeah,
all the plans that you have alluded to are very comprehensive plans that were meant to address the issue of access to infrastructure. And it was hoped that in the process, unemployment and poverty will also be addressed by the same interventions. But what you then realize is that most of those plans, the earlier ones, as GISA, RDP, and so on, the input that comes through when you look at them is what would have come mostly from international organizations, the Bretton Woods institutions. Those were the real technocrats then, and I think it has to be understood in context because in 1994, the only people who were from within the ANC that were engineers. I only know Trevor Fowler, who became mayor of Johannesburg. I am aware that there was a certain Mr. Corbett, who's now working for maybe Habitat Humanity or something like that. He became the first Director General of Housing. And then thirdly, there was Sakima Kozomo, and Mr. Corbett is not an engineer. I have to qualify that. Right. There was Sakima Kozomo, who became the first Director General of Transnet. Now, those were probably the most capable people in terms of designing the infrastructure policy going forward. And indeed, through their work and the work of Public Works Department then, the country was able to come with some very, very first world, in a way, and quite advanced and comprehensive policy papers, like the 1997 Green Paper on the creating an enabling environment for the growth and development of the construction sector and so on. If you look at the National Development Plan today and NIP, the National Infrastructure Plan 2012, which is projecting to have been fulfilled by 2050, its horizon in the year 2050, you will realize that the same problems and challenges they raised then are the same problems they are raising now. And they are not raising them from a point of view of saying, we have done a lot. Not really. They are not raising from the point of view. The issues are still there. The issues of a very intricate legislative framework, which is sometimes contradictory if it's not tedious. They are still there. So not to take from the government, they have taken access to water from 62% in 1994 to about 95, 96% today. They have taken access to electricity from 34% in 1994 to almost 90%, 91% today. And they've built more than 3 million houses, and the road infrastructure as well, railway infrastructure, which the main problem is maintenance. But we have got, I'm just giving an example with railway infrastructure. South Africa's GDP is 2%, which is 0.4% of the world GDP. But our rail network, if we just take just the length of it, it's 2% of the world rail network. So we've got a very comprehensive rail network. Our road infrastructure network is as extensive as that of France. So in many ways, a lot has been done since 1994 in terms of infrastructure and so on. But what has been problematic with our national plans has been the fact that they have not addressed inequality per se. And for that reason, they don't get the buy-in from the trade unions and and so on. That should be the problem that we should be addressing. And I think they call it structural issues in economics.
That's true. I think that's very true. But I like that you've given an overview of what engineering services look like. But maybe just your understanding of when we say public infrastructure, are we only speaking about housing, roads, or is there a larger, something larger which you can attach to? How do you understand public infrastructure?
Yeah, well, it is best explained with examples, but it really refers to all infrastructure units that are for public use, from water, sanitation, roads, railway, electricity, housing, waste management, all those things that are for communal use in a way, or maybe communal is not appropriate for housing because you build a house for one person. But that is what we refer to when we say public infrastructure, for access to broadband and so on. So when we say public infrastructure, that's what we are looking at. And I think the government has done extremely well. There was a time where the former President Mbeki, then when he was still president, was saying that it would be difficult to find examples across the world where that much access was created for so many people over such a short period of time. So we have actually provided infrastructure at a rate that some of the developmental states that we look up to they would really look at us and say, if we have not matched them, we have really given them a serious challenge. So from that front, it's perspective that needs to be managed, because when infrastructure is provided, the reporting is not on it. It's on the corruption that might have happened when it was being provided.
Well, I think you put it, I like the issue saying it's about perspective and context, but if I had to say, you let me know if I'm going in the wrong direction here, that what you've described, a lot of the achievements can be classified as your basic infrastructure, right? Obviously, electricity is more complex, and now that we have to think about broadband. But I want you to walk me through somebody who comes from, like, let's say, an Everton or Vembe district in Limpopo, right? Who says that, look, Mr. Maswime, fair enough. I think you're right in what you're saying. No, because I think that it can never be a debate that today is better than years ago. That can never be a starting point. I don't think anyone can really make that argument. But the question needs to be, how do you move to post basic infrastructure to the type of infrastructure that builds the new economy, where someone from Vembe or someone from Everton and Gauteng can now start to see themselves? We call it structural inequality issues. How do we get that type of engineering? Because I think you would agree with me, when people crow, or when people praise the Chinese, or even praise the Singapore government, what they're really speaking about is their ability to get rural, their version of townships, into their formal economy, and creating a bridge such that you can have a speed train that takes them back home, as opposed to only having a speed train, well, only in Gauteng, taking you to the airport. What would you say to that assessment then?
Yes, that's an important question. Look, when it comes to planning, South Africa is and policy drafting, we can match any country in the world. So we have taken the Chinese model to upgrade or to build new industries, new frontiers for or new cities. And this is what you hear about all the time: special economic zones. That was taken as it is from China with very little adjustment. It is the realization that if you go into an area, you identify a comparative advantage that area has in terms of maybe mineral resources, or being a strategic corridor or a hub for industrial development, or transport nodes and so on. You can actually build a town there, invest in that town, plan it properly in such a way that the people who live in the surrounds are now able to gain access to the formal economy. So a special economic zone like the one in Bembe, where you've given an example of Bembe, there's a special economic zone between Musina and Lutrigat, which has been planned for the last 10 or so years. Unfortunately, it has not really come off the ground yet. So the thinking is already there. Government's already thinking the right direction. It's just our ability to implement things fast and efficiently and effectively. That is, I think that is where we tend to be hamstrung. There are other special economic zones that have taken off the ground in Eastern Cape and so on. There's one in the Vaal. You made an example with Everton. So the problem we have now is, if you are going to see a truck driving into Everton, you can be 100% sure that it is full. It's carrying something. But if you see a truck driving out of Everton, you can be assured that that truck is empty. So that is why now Gauteng is talking about the township economy. The townships, as they were planned prior in the 40s, they have continued to be dormitories for a workforce where people wake up and go and work in town. They are not self-sustaining. The economy of the township has not really been paid to that economy. Gauteng is the only one that seems to be very aggressive, at least at rhetorical level, and maybe hopefully some things will start taking on the ground. Hence, people are even attacking malls because they are seeing malls as institutions that take from them. People are saying job creation and so on, but there's a study that was done in the Val that indicated that for every 1 rand, that's somebody who stays in the townships of Swugeng and so on, and the surrounding townships, for every 1 rand they get, they are going to spend 20 cents on transport, between 15 and 20 cents on transport, and only like 30 cents of that money will be spent there. The rest is going to be spent in Vereeniging, Van der Bijl Park, or Johannesburg, or elsewhere. So that is what needs to start changing. If we're talking about addressing inequality, we need to start having people stay where they work, or having work come to where they stay. So yeah, that will be a very important step in the right direction.
No. Thank you for that. I think I'll just quickly go through these numbers, and then you'll let me know what has changed. Because the Treasury says between 1998 and 1999 to 2018, 2019, the public sector spent close to 3.2 trillion. I repeat that, $1 trillion on infrastructure, and obviously expenditure increased during those times. But they've also saying there's been a decline, and I think even you as a civil engineer would admit that that's due to if the economy is not doing well, infrastructure doesn't do well. So I think the question is, walk me through what the next 10 years, if we had to say, listen, what are the major things we should really invest in public infrastructure, such that people who live in places like Bovembe, people that live in places like, or even Rustenburg, because if you take away the mines, it's a very dire situation. Maybe Mahikeng is a better example, or people that live in my area in the Vaal. What type of public infrastructure spending or plans need to be in place, and what would you change? 2 or 3 critical things you would change that really says we're moving at pace, not just that we're going to plan for planning's sake.
Yeah, okay, so we need to distinguish between the different typologies. If we are dealing with a place like Bembe, which is by and large rural, we first need to identify what kind of industries would be appropriate would thrive in an environment like that. And I can already see, for example, if we say Bembe, for example, has got a lot of, very fertile land. They produce a lot of fruits and vegetables and so on, with a capacity to supply probably the whole of our thing if it's mechanized and it's done properly. If government decides that we are earmarking this area of Livubu area where most of all these fruits and produce come from, so we are earmarking this area, we are identifying all strategic pieces of land. We are going to systematically develop this area in such a way that if we are investing on a road, it must be in line with that vision, that this is the road that will be used to transport the goods that will be produced from this area and so on. Then go even to the investor vendor and say, we are going to fund the Department of Agriculture to train, and even the FET colleges that are there. There are machines that are used in farms and so on. So mechanical engineering is strengthened and it's targeted. Then we become systematic from every industry, from every area of intervention, that it is seen that we are now working towards building an agricultural hub. Then we look at the secondary industry now, which is the processing industry. Then we can do agri-processing and so on and so. If you do that, there will not be a need for all the people in Bembe to go and work in Pretoria, for example. It will not be. You find that the area itself is self-sustaining, and you will then have trucks leaving Bembe going to the cities to transport all these goods. And in fact, they can easily go international because they have got macadamia nuts, they've got avocados, they've got everything. But if you look at the main market there in Chakuma, it's still a very much makeshift structure. Just for the government to say, we have identified this market, it produces, it makes more than R1 million every month. We are going to build a structure and enhance it so that it becomes convenient for storage and, you know, and just go architectural about it because it's a lot of tourists pass by and so on. Those are the type of systematic interventions that we need to have. And in the township, it's different. The townships, there are other industries like the steel industry in the valley, which has been badly decimated over the last 10 years, in part because even though we profess to want to aspire to be a developmental state starts with a certain level of protectionism. You protect your own industry, invest in them until they reach a certain competitive level, then you can open it up. So because of the cheap Chinese imports of steel and so on, our steel industry was decimated. From 2008, things started really going down and it hit the municipality very badly. They lost revenue very badly, but in the news, the municipality is branded as corrupt when it's failing to produce services. All the other things must not count. It must become corruption. Yeah, so it's those type of things that we need to really start thinking about.
No, I think, Mr. Gundo, I think you do say an important point, especially as it points to the media, that look, like I like what you stated, that listen, whether it's corruption or whichever, because I think we can still have a debate about cadre deployment, which we'll have later on. The key issue is you need to give a holistic view of the problem rather than just sticking to one thing. So I do like that point which you're saying. And maybe it brings me to the issue of just what you said, your interactions with public policy and vis-a-vis engineering. Now, in engineering, my reasons, and I think there's a reason why civil engineering is always considered one might say the king of engineering, because its linkages to the economy and also the logical way it works. Because if I'm not mistaken, the Chinese, I think the 90s, because they normally have these 10-year plans, that identified that, listen, we need to invest X amount of money to produce about 1,000 or 10,000 engineers a year. That's why you see that the early leadership of the Chinese were civil engineers, by and large. But what they did very well, and I want you maybe to speak to this in the relation to public policy, is because people always assume the Chinese model is about perfection, but when you speak to their policymakers, they tell you it's about experimentation, and then you fix the problem, which is very much how civils approach problems, which is to say, what is the quickest solution to it, and what risk are we willing to take to get to the end result? And if we find that we're getting to the end result, how do we fix it going backwards? So do you think maybe there's a role for public, let's say civil or engineering type of thinking in South African public policy thinking? There seems to be a disjuncture for me, because it seems as though we've taken the legal route, and the law is always about perfection, but when you tell them, but that's not the reality, and the constitutional people say, no, but perfection. And then we get stuck in perfection. So just your thinking on how do we get more civil engineering type of thinking into public policy and not do away, but let's say minimize these constitutional law people in public policy?
Yeah, no, you're on the ball, TK, because if you think about it, if you read through the South African legislation as it applies to the development of public infrastructure, you don't go to, you won't read 3 pages before you realize it was written by legal and financial minds. It's about financial prudence, and it's about preventing corruption, and then all of that covered in accountability. It's not so much about service delivery. Service delivery is only in the Constitution. The Constitution will say that the government will establish municipalities that will be developmental in their nature and so on. It stays there. But when it comes down, you have the Structures Act, which just looks at the structures, the in local government. And I prefer local government because that's really where things happen. The national and provincial is the top up. Then if you look at Municipal Finance Management Act, that is where infrastructure is governed, and it's actually called finance, that act. In fact, in local government, there's no legislation that pertains to infrastructure directly. Everything is either municipal finance, preferential procurement, framework act, it's at that level. We don't have a dedicated legislation that deals with municipal infrastructure. And why is that the case? The reason, as I said earlier, is that at the time that most of these were created, the ANC didn't have engineers. The ANC, and there's historical reasons for that. The first VC of UJ, Dr. Jan de Lange, JP de Lange, who was the chairperson of the Broederbond. He was commissioned to do a study in the 80s, where they were determining which skills will be needed for a South African economy that might be crippled by sanctions and so on. And the critical skills were engineering, civil engineering. And how do you create those skills? They said it will need for universities to open up to take students from other races. And it will also determine that if that happens, by year 2000, South Africa will have the same number of white engineers as it's got engineers of other races. But that will solve the problem significantly. The country couldn't accept that then, so it remained closed. What they did was they acceded to an agreement that universities can take a certain number of students of color, and they would then say, unlike before, you don't apply to the government and then apply to the university if you are going to a traditional white university. Those were the universities where engineering could be studied. So this thing worked completely against the ANC because they came in and they didn't have people who studied the thing. Those that had studied it, that they could have trusted. The first generation of engineers that the ANC probably would have considered, like Truman Gobas, Mahlodi, they finished their degrees but could not work in engineering, white engineering firms. They were afraid they won't get government tenders, so they sent them to their partners overseas. They were coming from the UK as well, so they didn't really understand the context of South African engineering. So we have that gap between engineering policy making and the policies that we have that come from finance and law. And for that reason, there are clashes that you see from time to time as an engineer in public service. You can see that if there was an engineer really, this clause should not have been there. For example, I can't wait for another 6 months. They re-advertise, reconstitute 3 bid committees, when a contractor has failed to execute a road construction project. Because I've got a road that is half done. And when it's half done, it's exposed to the weather. When it rains, those layers are being washed off. And by the time I finish that 6 month process, the road is not what it was when I started the process. And when the Auditor General comes, he will say, but this road was budgeted for 10 million. You have now spent 15 or 20 million. They don't take any explanation that the layer was wiped off while we are following procedure. And if you are too fast, you bring in another contractor. It's called unauthorized expenditure as well. And when it goes to the media, it's corruption. When it goes to the media, it's corruption. So there are those stacking conflicts in our legislative processes where a supply chain person is sitting in a bid committee with a law person, an internal auditor, and a COO. whatever profession they come from, and they are hardly ever engineers. Then there's one engineer who's trying to explain, you cannot score this one like this, because a sewer pipe is not the same as a water pipeline that is has cathodic protection, is flowing under pressure. For them, a pipe is a pipe. You dig, you lay the pipe, you know. So we've got all those things, but we need to start looking at who must be sitting there, because procurement, for example, is part of engineering practice. But now in our legislation, it's a supply chain function. The engineer is trained from conception to design. Once he has designed, he must now procure. He is trained to know what to look at in a company that would increase the chances of that company executing the work properly. But our legislation twists that part and say, okay, you can do everything, but we'll pull procurement out of the engineer to be done by everyone else. And then everyone else does that, brings the complete opposite of what is needed. When the project collapses, the engineer is blamed. So the other problem of that disjuncture between our policy and so on is that the engineers are now even reluctant to work for government. And what does the government do? Positions that engineers must also do. They will take technicians, they will take technologists, because we are all trained differently. We were not supposed to be doing the same things. Like in a hospital, you have a doctor, you have a physiotherapist, you have got a dietitian, you have got all those are built environment skills. You have an engineer, you have a quantity surveyor, you have a technician, a technologist, and so on. They are supposed to help each other. But now in our case, if you go across the municipalities, you will be surprised how many are just run with just technologists and technicians.
Which also brings me to the case of sometimes you hear this Cuban engineers, which, yeah, please explain that. I think there's this common South African saying, please balance me with that one. What does it mean to have Cuban engineers? Understanding their system, like you say, every system is different per country, but just balance me on that one, please.
Look, TK, the truth is that engineering is a very universal skill, in the sense that as an engineer, I should be able to stand up and go and design a bridge in the US. If I know the type of soil, the geotechnical report on the conditions, I should be able to do it anyway. So for that reason, there are certain peculiar issues where countries have brought engineers from outside, and not just engineers, even surveyors. South Africa is one of such countries. If you go to Pooe right now, you will be shocked at just the sheer number of French engineers that work there. Because when the thing was built during sanctions, France was the only country that really didn't care. If anything, they needed to support the apartheid system, and they wanted it to survive. So they sent more than 1,000 engineers. We have recruited engineers from Germany and elsewhere in Europe in large numbers. When Randwater was running out of skilled professionals, they went US, UK, everywhere. Engineers were recruited. South African telecommunications and the postal services somewhere in the 70s. We even had offices 8 offices in different parts of Europe that were recruiting engineers from there. Now you would say that was the previous government, but I can tell you that even after 1994, we have recruited engineers from Germany to help at ESCOM. When we transitioned from the normal coordinate system, which was called longitude 31, to the current one that is interfacing with satellites, we brought in French and American engineering surveyors to help us. They were working with the surveyor general. So it's very common for countries to bring engineers from elsewhere. But what you need to select is what kind of skill do they bring? So with the Cuban engineers, there is a thinking amongst many South Africans that they are doing work that any engineer anywhere can do. I have worked with Cuban engineers. They were recruited in KZN in the early 2000s, in their numbers as well. So it's not even a new thing. And did an absolute fantastic job. Those guys are not trained in the use of software the way we train our engineers. They work from basic principles. So they are very suited for very rural areas. You know, they have that ability to improvise, and they were training local engineers there and so on. So I saw that, and I felt a lot of people are saying the real uproar came from professional organizations that felt that their consultants should have been the ones doing the work. It didn't come so much from people who are saying we have a lot of engineers that are unemployed sitting at home. Really, this country has a shortage of engineers. Most of the engineers that will be unemployed and sitting at home, it's either they are retired or they are freshly graduated from college. There isn't a lot of engineers who've been retrenched from the work who are sitting at home. And even those that are there, they are frictionally unemployed. There are people who would transition from one job to another. I think we overreacted with the deployment of Cuban engineers. That I think the context was, I think we really overreacted. But this is the challenge. The Minister of Water and Sanitation, which was still with Human Settlements then, Minister Sisulu, she had an ultimatum from the Human Rights Commission about the spillage and the contamination of the River River system. She had an ultimatum from the Human Rights Commission to act. And that was like, I think 2 years ago when that report came out for the first time. She had to wait for the procurement system throughout that time, that 2-year period. Remember, our legislation doesn't allow politicians to participate in anything procurement. Otherwise, it's called corruption immediately. So she had to sit and wait in the flanges. Even when you prevail on your administration and say act quickly, they can say it's undue pressure. And we have seen that with Patricia de Lille's department, where the Director General said we are being pressured unduly and so on. And when it comes out, even one MEC, I think for sports in Gauteng, who was saying, make sure there are combi courts there before this month. And people were saying she's targeting elections and so on. So politicians have got that challenge. Then they have to look at all avenues. And in her case, she realized that because of the standing agreement we have with Cuba, she could easily pull that resource to help her while the department is organizing itself. And when she acted on it, there was this uproar. So you can realize sometimes you will find that you've got all these things. However, the main issue that I think the South African engineering community has not been able to do that they should have done. There are agreements. It's a Washington Accord, which about 41 countries came together and say, if you're an engineer in this country, you can work in this country as well. They've evaluated their programs and so on. And then there is another Canadian one, another accord for technicians and technologists. It's a separate accord. So there's a question of whether these Cubans are engineers, technicians, or technologists, because the new government came in and never bothered to think that they are going to need engineers maybe from Cuba, from India, from all those countries, China, and so on. And then there is no agreement that makes it possible. So the Engineering Council had not certified or accredited engineers coming from Cuba. So that also becomes an issue that they are now practicing illegally. But they can practice, they just cannot put their signatures on the designs. A certified professional engineer has to put a signature on it. So that's the other thing to think about.
Just on that though, Mr. Gundo, I think as we head towards the closure is looking at schools of engineering in South Africa, the big ones, obviously. Do you think enough change has been made such that we can say, look, we are now seeing more African, coloreds, Indians coming through into engineering services and becoming fully qualified engineers and getting their PR-Engs and the like? Or do you still think that that's the fact it's still controlled, or it's still influenced by maybe the past regime? And maybe, like you said, this is where the problem comes in, that the government is not fully trusting of the look of certain engineers, or maybe it's not trusting because of the history of the country. Where are we standing on the production of, the next generation of civil engineers for government to tap into, and also for them to also start influencing public policy?
I have been in the public sector for about 15 years, and I was talking recently with some of my colleagues in UCT, saying, how come have I met, I only remembered one engineer from UCT, that actually two that I met in the public sector in 15 years. I know there's more than two, but overwhelmingly, I have met technicians, technologists, and if it's engineers, I've seen a lot of UKZN. I have seen quite a bit of vets, but I have not met anyone from Stellenbosch, for example. I've met one from Stellenbosch. So what I think has been happening is that a lot of engineers come from university with very little appreciation of the public sector space. Most of them are sponsored by the big companies. They go and work there. And when they work for these big companies, whether they are construction or consulting firms, because the companies are big, they are given very specific tasks. And they grow in that space, and they only have a limited number of skills. And then much later, when they are much older, they have become senior enough in the company to go and meet with the client. That is where I would have seen them, But the ones that are coming from Mangosuthu Technical, Valley University of Technology, TUT, and so on, they are not sponsored by the big companies. They go and work for the smaller companies. And in 3 years' time, the smaller companies, they take any job that comes. And the same engineer is doing, next thing is jumping, is doing a road, is doing water, is doing this. Then the owner says, hey, today I'm meeting this client, come with me because you did the design. So they, even though they might not be as technically astute, also from their training, but they get exposed very quickly. And then before you know it, when they leave, they form their own company. And who do they call in the design room as the company grows? The engineers from UCT and so on. So there is that happening. But the other thing is that universities are channels that they are like conveyor belts or as we assembly lines. You are going to produce an engineer, yes, but with a certain worldview. So I've seen that worldview, if the universities, some of the traditionally white universities, do not prevail on it, because you're a lecturer, you are constantly telling students about how inept government is. For that 4 or 5 years that the student is studying engineering. And you expect that when they come out, they will go and work for the government. No, they won't work for the government. In fact, most of them finish and go and work overseas. There is quite a significant number of engineers that finish and go and work overseas. It's only now where our programs are now shifting. So let's look at municipal engineering. let's infuse that into the curriculum. Let's look at public sector engineering, the stakeholder management, and so on, so that they start, and then we give them practical experience on their work. Let them go and sit in a municipality to observe, or the municipal infrastructure support agency, MISA. Let them go and work there. Those interactions are opening students to new possibilities that actually we have got a very competitive state, where even when they go there, they are learning, because our engineers come riding very high horses that with a lot of confidence that I can design a bridge through the through the harbor, and I can do all sorts of exploits. So we have that challenge that we are not producing engineers with the right social conscience, and we are only starting to turn that around now.
I like that. Engineers with the social conscience. Mr. Gundo, as we wrap up now, I call this section, what should we look out for? Which is, what should we expect from you in the coming few years? I know you are now, you're still doing consulting, but you are now an academic. And, what should we look out for from you? I mean, if you could tell our listeners and our viewership, what should we look out for from Mr. Gundo Maswime? What's next for you?
I didn't think this was going to get personal, TK, because it's not easy to talk about yourself. But my focus right now is on the science of implementation of infrastructure projects. So that is what is going to be preoccupying me for the next 3 years. And when it pertains to projects that are done in the public sector, that as an engineer, you now are starting to look at the politics administration interface. How do you navigate that? Secondly, while all these government programs that we have come up with, SIPTIM and toolkits and so on, why have they not made the kind of impact that they have made? So now engineers must now also pay attention to organizational dynamics. So that's the research that I'm doing. Implementation science, dissemination science, which is about once you have conceived these programs, like labor-intensive construction, how do you roll them out properly? Because we have got great, fantastic programs. We have got great administrators, great engineers, but the fuse is like the cords are not joining. So my research in the next 3 years would focus almost entirely on that connection, and with a specific emphasis on municipal infrastructure. So that is what I'll be doing over the next 3 years.
No, thanks, Mr. Maswime from the University of Cape Town, civil engineer, former. Do you ever stop being a civil servant, or you just park it for now?
No, once a civil servant, always a civil servant.
Yes, and I think most important, like you said, an engineer with a soul and a conscience for the Republic of South Africa. Mr. Maswime, thank you so much. And I'm hoping to host you again, because I think I did like the interface between public policy, the economy, which you touched on, and I think it's something we should revisit on this show. And I'm hoping you'll come back again.
Thank you, TK, and thank you for hosting me, man. Thank you.
No, anytime, Mr. Maswime.
Sure.